Hello, beautiful community. I need your help to know if you can hear me, and then we'll try to ground ourselves a bit because it's very important to not freak out. And of course, what's going on here is stuff that affects the world because the United States is so impactful across the globe. Let us see if somebody's saying this too shall pass. Let us see if you can hear me, and let us hear if you can see me. And then we will ground ourselves a tiny bit. Hello, Johnny. Hello, Amalfitano. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for hearing and seeing and seeing and hearing. Okay. So I'm not surprised by what happened last night. And what I want to do here is not an analysis, but a little bit of a grounding exercise for everybody who is just worried about democracy at a moment like this. There's a part of me that thought that I should actually do a more analytical main channel video, but health and the instinct that I don't want to get involved just yet this weekend in this conversation in such a definitive analytical way persuaded me, and of course I'm persuaded that very often just trying to ground ourselves in a smaller group is better. And this is why, hello Rachel, and this is why I want to do this. This will keep happening over and over and over and over and over and over. The bad glitch yesterday, democratic glitch, is something we will face over and over and over again in the next 20, 30 years as our democracies decline, as our institutions stutter. There will be many wins and there are going to be many losses. And I stick to the old image of us coming out of the bay and getting into open water. And we're still on the way out of the bay. We're come out of the bay and we're going through a few channels with still islands around. It's bumpier than before. It's not as bumpy as it is going to be. So prematurely incinerating our hair on fire misses the central point. And that is that this is a bit of a marathon. And even if Trump becomes the next president of the United States, which is the most likely outcome, and was the likely outcome in my view, even if Biden had won the debate yesterday, that is still one stopping point among 10, 20, 30 more stopping points. And the other stopping points are still ones where we can have wins and losses, where we can have moments of positive inflection or negative inflection of the democratic decline. You can't stop democratic decline, but you can magnify and intensify it, and you can slow and reduce it, partially reverse it. There are going to be wins and there are going to be losses. And I think it's still the psychology that everything is okay, but Trump's going to ruin it all, that gets us freaked out in an unconstructive way. And here we need to understand that, yes, there's a lot of things Trump could ruin as president, but it will be even more important to act constructively after Trump. Right? What we do in 2028, what democracies do after they have episodes of democratic recession that are greater than what we've seen in recent history, what European democracies who experience this do, after that happens, is even more important than what we do now. So we need to begin culturing ourselves, right, into the thought that this is a marathon and this is a journey, and not dealing with each democratic threat as though it were a sort of terminally dangerous aberration that we must deal with now, and if we don't, everything is over. No, dealing with Trump over the next half a decade, whether there's a Trump presidency or not, is one of the many challenges that we will face. So we do not want to hyperventilate 500 meters outside of the bay. We're heading for open water, and even when it's much bumpier, we won't sink, right? So it's about understanding that this is a process, that are going to be wins and losses, and it's about understanding that even when things get worse and much more bumpy, we were not going to sink. And if we do sink, it'll be some of us, but not most of us. It'll be a couple of countries that go in the West, other countries won't. And the couple of countries that go may even have a chance of coming back. So there's absolutely no point in shutting our eyes, looking at the sky, and screaming 500 meters out of the bay when we're heading into open waters. Hello, Evie, into more difficult conditions than we're in now. And even those conditions are not going to be terminal for us. Now, we have to understand that we shouldn't be saccharine about this, that a Trump presidency will make a lot of things harder. I mean, there is a video on the main channel. Thank you, Marilei. And I see there is another question there. There's a video on the main channel about the breakup of the global order. And what we've got is this sort of carousel of interconnected conflicts, carousel of friends and enemies in certain respects. Within that carousel, a lot of unlovely regimes are making moves in a partially dissolved global order. Yes, Trump will be an accelerator for this. Whether you're talking about Taiwan, Azerbaijan, Serbia, whatever. I don't want to get into any particular global crisis, but I will take questions if they're specifically about Ukraine. But Trump will be an accelerator of the breakdown, the already ongoing breakdown of the global order. But what we want to do is not cry and freak out, but think about deceleration and renewal right after his term in office if he wins. So it's an accelerator of all the bad interconnected global patterns if he wins. It's also an attack on US democracy. It's going to be an attack on the institutions, attack on the civil service. But the single most plausible, it's always uncertain and anything can happen. The single most plausible outcome for US domestic politics after a Trump presidency is that the United States will be less democratic when Trump leaves office. How catastrophically less democratic? We don't know. But it will be less democratic. But it's not plausible or realistic or wise to think that it's going to be game over. It's not going to be game over. It's not remotely likely to be game over after Trump's second term, if he has one. So I think there's a realm of pessimism here, but there's also a realm for understanding that we're humans stuck on this planet. We're limitlessly beautiful and clever animals with amazing ways of organizing our politics and extraordinary vicissitudes of historical transformation that we continually live through. That's life. And it's true that we're not going to be in the most comfortable elbow room position for the next few decades. But there is no game here that's going to be over. And so positioning ourselves to be better at handling this is important, right? We're always um, tending to confuse the opening set of a match with the entire match in a world in which the match may never even be completely over. It may be a match with an endless number of sets. So this is really, really important. The thing that in a way started my conversation with you is the feeling that a lot of Western citizens are stuck in, that either thinks that it's the end or that everything is okay and the few glitches we're experiencing are just aberrations. And the problem with sort of a lot of citizens is that they oscillate between the two, which is really hard for your mental health. And it's also really hard for your efficacy as citizens. So we have to understand that the ocean is still 10 kilometers out, open ocean is still 10 kilometers out. We will get there, and when we're there, we won't sink. And in fact, we'll talk to each other, having been in the open ocean for quite a while, and say, okay, this is not good, but this is not catastrophic. No, let's see how we go. Now, that's a little bit to get us going. I noticed a question about David Packman earlier. I haven't seen David's full response. David Packman is a wonderful colleague on YouTube. David's younger than me, I think. He's well over 2 million subscribers now, and he, whatever you think of David's views, his content is very responsible, and behind the content, he is much more thoughtful than his own content suggests. He consumes much more sophisticated stuff than his own content. Mm. There's a wonderful, responsible voice on YouTube, and I'm extremely proud of him. I do think that on this particular issue, David's been in denial for several years about Biden's cognitive decline. But I thought his immediate reaction yesterday was entirely adequate. The next question is, does David think Biden should go? And this is a difficult conversation because at a big picture level, the answer obviously has to be yes. But in practice, there is no point in a yes if it's badly delivered. And I think David's sensibility should be, at the moment, is probably that Biden needs to stay. My guess remains that he may well go, but that the plausible expectation is that he probably stays for now. But this is an open story. But on top of all the procedural difficulties of Biden going, three things politically need to be in place. One is that if Biden were to go, Biden needs to own this. Biden needs to be the leader of that change. The second thing that needs to happen is that the replacement cannot be Kamala Harris, who will lose to Trump. And the third thing that needs to happen is that there needs to be a replacement who is genuinely suited to beating Trump. There are some excellent politicians who are just not suited to beating Trump. If this process were to be moved forward with, the advantage the Democratic Party would have is that they know exactly who their opponent is and what it takes to beat him. This should not be somebody who's going to be the best possible president. It should be someone who is suitable for beating Trump. If you can't handle the politics of all of this well, then perhaps there is no point in moving Biden on. Obviously, there is an ethical question here about Jill and about Joe Biden and what they're thinking and how it got to this. There's a video from 2 years ago about very disturbing cognitive decline in Biden on the chat channel. Let me then say something else that I think is worth mentioning that people are freaking out about. And that goes back to the question about David Pakman. I felt David didn't quite take seriously Biden's cognitive decline over the last few years. There are a lot of people, including people in this community, who don't see that anything horrific happened in yesterday's event. They just feel Biden didn't do well, but they don't see what happened as something in the realm of a medical event, right? And here, compassion is very important, but that also an important political lesson is important. The compassion is important because, as I know so well from, for instance, the world of classical music and musicology, in which I have a few toes, you do have sometimes musical performances that are horrendous, and a lot of smart people saying, well, I didn't see too much wrong with that. And you often see extraordinary musical performance and smart people say, I don't see what was so good about that. So the degree to which we hear what we want to hear is extraordinary because we're all human beings. At the same time, in a radically polarized world where we're broken up into our own bubbles, and let's face it, right? We've got a small group of 800 people here. Virtually nobody's a Trump supporter here of the American citizens who are in this in our small room. So we've got to be realistic about taking seriously how much we're in bubbles, how much we're in fact bubbles, but also how dangerous it is not to realize bits of reality that we deny only because we're stuck in our own bubble. So, it's not just a problem that if you don't think that what happened yesterday is in the realm of a medical event, not in the realm of a bad performance, then you're not just gaslighting your opponents who you need to beat. You're not just gaslighting your allies, you're also gaslighting yourself. And we gaslight ourselves constantly when we are in a dynamic of democratic decline, because part of the very reason we're in democratic decline is we do not have a realistic picture of what is happening to us. So we democratic citizens, in various respects, constantly go around gaslighting ourselves and pretending that we're in a world in which we're not. And so on the one hand, you need deep compassion about that. On the other hand, you need to be truthful about, forget Biden, forget this particular issue, forget even the prospect of a Trump presidency. In general, we need to stop gaslighting ourselves about our own side. And the instinct of so many people who feel they're ethical and responsible citizens is, why would you say that? Why would you call that out? Why would you do this? And must say, I have very lovingly received a lot of messages about why Biden doesn't have a cognitive decline, because I've been talking about it for a couple of years. And that is not just a mistake. It's about how we're stuck in our bubbles. A very beautiful philosopher I love was once asked a question in the room. And the question was, do you have any advice for me? Because I'm talking in my life to somebody who comes from a spiritual tradition which denies that pain is real. And the philosopher I love said, well, your friend's problem isn't that they don't understand pain, it's that they don't understand something at an earlier stage, at a previous level. That is, that they don't understand the difference between reality and illusion. So the people who are not able to see, and I'm speaking to you because there's some of you here who are not able to see the significance of Joe Biden's condition, who are still sending me videos about how he performed better today. The problem with you is not that you're not able to understand cognitive decline here or there. The problem is that you are not able to understand how to live in a world of bubbles and how to reflectively exist in your own bubble without being blinded by your own bubble. So the error is at a deeper level. And that's why it's not constructive to argue back and forth. Oh, no, here Biden was smoother than before. Oh, no, he wasn't and he got stuck. Oh, no, he didn't. He spoke much, much better. So Trombone is saying, why am I confident of a Trump victory? I'm not confident of a Trump victory. I just think that it's the likely outcome. A lot can change in politics. But I've felt since 2020 that Biden was likely to lose. I've put it in one of two ways. I always sort of talk in loose terms about this because I understand these are just little clues and expectations we're discussing, not actual probabilities. But I've sometimes said it's 50-50 leaning Trump all the way for the last few years. Or I've said it's sort of 70% in Trump's favor. It's going to be decided by a small number of voters in a small number of states. Sure, it's close. But when I look at current Betfair polls, which put Trump at 1 in 5 to 1 in 6, odds, I mean, not polls. Can I argue against that? Maybe a bit. Maybe I could argue against that a bit. I could bring it closer to 50-50 than that. But I couldn't bring it to 50-50 at the moment, realistically. Some things need to change. And then here's the problem. The challenge Biden has is only going to get worse because it was so bad in 2020 that I felt it was borderline unethical for him to run because of his cognitive decline. In 2019, he lucked out in part because of Trump's appalling mishandling of the public health crisis. And that was really marvelous for Joe because it would have been a very long political career ruined by hubris if he had lost. But now he is on course to have the single most important event of his political career be a hubris mediated bit of damage to American democracy. If he hands America over to Trump, that'll be the single most consequential part of his political career. And at the moment, he might well avoid that, might well avoid it, but that's where we're heading at the moment. Well, two things motivated Biden in my analysis. One is that he genuinely thought he was a very effective politician, and I agree with that. Whether you like his policies or not, I think he's been a slightly more effective politician than Barack Obama in the last 4 years. That's a paradox here. The second thing that drove him on is just that consciousness of your powers that you have, that you think, yeah, I'm really good at this, so I've got to do this job. And even if the timing is wrong, I've just got to do this job. And that drove him on very much. Also with the sense that somebody as vastly experienced as him can just ride roughshod through situations where he's obviously at 30% of his power, in public at least. And he felt, well, screw it. If it's 30%, it's 30%. I can do this. Because the core question is, am I making responsible decisions behind the scenes? And the answer is yes. I mean, let's analyze Biden's immediate reaction to Putin's invasion of Ukraine. In my judgment, the reaction was twofold. Let's moderate nuclear risk, and let us be agnostic about what is actually motivating Putin because we don't have a good analysis of it. Now, I might argue that you needed more from the United States. You needed an analysis of what Putin was doing and why, and that there was enough time to get that analysis. But under the circumstance of that analysis not being there, Biden responded like a cautious and a serious political actor. And if a crisis occurred tomorrow, even though he couldn't speak yesterday, I think he'd still respond as responsibly. Will he respond as responsibly in 2026? I don't know. But here is the paradox. It's a political case that particular institutions, particular individuals need to make to replace Biden. And there's no point in doing that unless it's done well. But from a big picture perspective, obviously it is utterly deranged and a sort of extraordinary manifestation of democratic decline that Biden's been there. And that was my view before yesterday. Yesterday hasn't changed that. An extraordinary manifestation of democratic decline that Biden was running. Not that he's there now, but he was running for the second term. It's a serious challenge that's a product of the decline of our political institutions, not just in the United States, but everywhere. So this is everywhere. This is not just an American problem. It happened to manifest like this. We've got a candidate who is running for a second term that perhaps shouldn't be there. But this is a problem we all have with our politics. So that's why I'm as cautious as I am about this question of should Biden go, even though the big picture answer is yes, you should start with the presumption that he's going and then try to work out how to do that. And if there is absolutely no way to do that, then you don't do it. I can't go further than this and legislate on this more explicitly at this stage because I want to have a more emotional conversation and because I want to be cautious about too rapidly getting into nuance of US politics, which is why I'm not going to talk about alternative candidates and so on. But that's roughly where we are. And my big bit of advice is let us sort of not expire 10 times prematurely when we don't need to, because we're going to be okay enough. And somebody said this too shall pass. And I think in a way that's fair. The democratic decline won't pass, but particular bad moments in it always pass, and better moments will come. There is no doubt about that. And our job as citizens is to see the long line and not to just unconstructively hyperventilate in the second act of a 27-act play. Let's have a look. Hi there, Pavel. Hi there, James, who is saying, mean things about the DNC. Marilla saying vote blue. There's Kieran. There's Johnny. Thank you. Paolo. Yeah, Paolo, don't freak out. Right? Don't freak out. You know, it's a scary ball to receive when things go wobbly in a democracy, but you're going to have to return many different other kinds of balls across the net. And some of that will go really badly. Some will go surprisingly well. D is saying, how can Biden or anyone else say anything about Netanyahu clinging to power when Biden is at risk of handing over presidency to Trump? So there are two problems with what happened yesterday. One is what happened, and the second is the gaslighting. it is worse than the bad performance in the debate, if Biden is staying, to come out and say nothing bad happened. Now, 20% of what the Biden team needs to say they are saying: bad performance, bad night, didn't speak well, not who I used to be in freshness or speed. Barack Obama has come out and said this was bad, but bad days happen. I think you need to go a lot further to really not gaslight voters. And you need to be honest. I'm not sure you should use the term cognitive decline. This is more hardcore politics now, but I won't stay long on this. But you should concede much more. You should say, yeah, it's really bad. And the way you say it is by tying it to Trump's lies. So, yeah, it was so bad that obviously President Biden didn't have an opportunity as a result of such a bad performance to challenge the endless lies that Trump came up with. But how this is handled is even more important than what happened. And the perceptions around the globe of how this is handled are just as important as the perceptions of what happened. So a democracy where that happens and everybody pretends that nothing bad has happened is truly a democracy that's struggling. But that's crisis, right? That is crisis. That is not collapse. So, I mean, we're fusing these two things, please. Democracies that are in crisis do not collapse. Historically, democracies have lived through a lot of crisis. Ukraine is a democracy that's having to some extent, suspend democracy because it's living through a crisis. Western democracies also have a history of living through big crises of different kinds. So the resilience of democracy is an extraordinary thing. But of course, its resilience, while strong, is always going down because our world's becoming more fragmented, more polarized, and more devoid of the minimal levels of trust necessary for some minimal convergence on solidarity and the public good. Suzanne, thank you so much. So what we want to see here is a wide context which says this is not a one-off event in Biden's election campaign. This is something that evolves over months. Then we want to say that Biden's campaign is itself just one event of many in the future history of US democracy over the next 10, 20 years. Then we want to say that while so many American democratic challenges are American, the fundamental challenges are global or Western wide. We all face them. We're going to be dancing with them for decades. This is, a dance. And what we have to understand is that dances in the history of literature and art come in very different forms. There are even some dances in which the dancers tear themselves to pieces. But there are dances that have a lot of darkness to them, but they're still dances. And we have to keep dancing. We can't stop dancing. So that rigidity, which says it's all okay, stop exaggerating, or that rigidity which says this is the worst thing on earth, it's over, what's over? Everything is over. No, everything is not over. And indeed, Biden can still win in November. It's just, as we stand, just not the likely outcome. How will the EU react in a Trump era? Lots of love to the community from Tim. This is the extraordinary power of the United States. If in 2037 French democracy collapses absolutely and US democracy is kind of going okay, US democracy will be okay if France's democracy collapses. But if US democracy collapses in 2037, there will be real difficulty avoiding the domino effect in Europe. We're going to see this to some extent with Ukraine if Trump wins and he does bad things on Ukraine. It'll be really hard for Europe to come up to standard and take up a much bigger strategic and security role. But more widely speaking, there's this real dependence on the United States. European democracy will be threatened if US democracy collapses in 2040. But this is what's really important. Imagine Trump wins. That period that follows him will be absolutely crucial. And if that period is really badly screwed up, then the term after into the 2030s will be absolutely crucial to get right. And yeah, by then you could be playing a game when you're 3-0 down at halftime. So sorry about my appalling sports analogies. Um, Football game. Um, and we're going to have to try to come back from being 3-0 down in 2032 then. And then by we, I don't mean America, I mean the whole West, because we'll also be facing similar challenges. But here is what I will say that's really important, that also connects to this distinction between the bay and the ocean. Trump is not the populist, anti-democratic politician of the 2030s. He is the populist, anti-democratic politician of the 2020s. He's a buffoon. And we're still in the age of there being a lot of populist buffoons about. We're in the age of the post-truth populist buffoon. And my anticipation is that the difficulty of these people who come our way will increase. So we're going to be dealing not with buffoons like Trump and Johnson, who can't get stuff done behind the scenes. I mean, you lock the door on these people, they cannot act politically. Trump will be better at this, which is worse for the world if he wins. He understands he couldn't build an elite around him, and he'll try to do that more, and people around him will be worse. But we are still dealing with these populist buffoons, and in the 2030s, they're going to be replaced by Viktor Orban type politicians. So I'm predicting this historical moment to shift from populist buffoon to a much more strategic, disciplined, hard-nosed politician. They're going to be our enemy. Imagine even if Biden's cognitive decline were 50% better, what an apocalyptic obliteration of Biden a Viktor Orban would organize if he were in Trump's place. Trump can't do that. He's a brilliant communicator, but brilliant at the post-truth communication, gambit. But his efficacy as a political actor is still really low. So what we're looking at is a really quite weak authoritarian who is so much easier to beat, so much easier to beat than Trump 2.0. After Trump is no longer in the world, the Trump 2.0 will be much harder to beat. And so whether we lose or win, the next democratic challenges that we face in the United States and Britain, whether we get a few authoritarian figures who want to break the democratic game in power, we still, either way, have to prepare for Trump's 2.0, for hard-nosed people who want to break democracy. Biden wins a second term or a Biden replacement wins a second term, we still have that challenge. Trump wins, we still have that challenge. So, however things go in the United States in the next few months for the United States, the bigger challenges still lie beyond what happens over the coming months, right? And therefore, even if 20% of the game goes really badly, you don't want to freak out to a point where you paralyze yourselves for the 80% of the game that's to go, right? And if you are in your 70s, if you're in your 80s, if you're in your 90s, this is a talk. This is a conversation about your children, your grandchildren, and so on. Let's see what you guys are saying. Maybe just scroll up a little bit. People are asking me about Project 25. Would ditching Biden be a bad point, a bad thing at this point? I mean, let me speak loosely on something like Project 2025. Trump and his team will be more prepared to dismantle US democracy than they were in 2020. But Trump's skill set for doing so is low, even though he personally feels that there are learnings from before, because he feels he just got co-opted. And interestingly, as I often say, this is an analysis of Trump's first term that Putin shares. Putin feels Trump got co-opted. I still think Trump will be co-opted, but less so, and therefore with more damage to US democracy. The expectation I have is that many scenarios are possible, but the default scenario is that the United States is just less democratic, but it still remains a democracy where effective competition is entirely possible by the end of Trump's term. But this is what we have to understand that's even more fundamental than what I've just said. We're talking about people who want to get systematic, who want to build toolkits, who want to build enterprises designed to use democracy to break democracy. And that's a very paradoxical thing, but that's the sort of challenge within that we're dealing with. And the best way to beat this sort of challenge is, of course, to outperform some of these people in how we communicate to their voters, rather than dismissing and poo-pooing their voters as delusional citizens who should wise up. Is this a generational problem? Shark is asking. I think that the generational problem is that as we move to the younger generations, the pool of people who want to be in politics as serious actors is decreasing, and the pool of people who want to be entrepreneurs in politics is growing, it's giant. And then there is then this smaller but growing pool of people who want to be not just entrepreneurs surfing the waves of public sentiment, but who want to be post-truth anti-democratic populists, people who want to not just lie, break the very distinction between truth and lies, and break counter-majoritarian institutions, courts, elections, media. So the scoop is becoming narrow. I mean, when I talk to people in their 70s and 80s who've had a history of teaching at the world's leading universities, one of the things they tell me is how many fewer people relatively to the 70s and the 80s want to go seriously into politics. It's an epic, epic drop. I already felt it, when I was a student in my different degrees, and it's worse. That was, almost 20 years ago, and it's worse now. We need a new profile of politician who has some new qualities that work in our polarized populist moment, but qualities that are compatible with being institutional and constitutional. And one of the things I'm always watching out for is a modicum of measured but responsible populism in new up and coming politicians. That's a very important thing to watch out for, because we need some politicians of the younger generation who are somewhat populist in a pro-institutional way. Pro-institutional, Caro, thank you, can be critical of institutions, but with the understanding that being critical of institutions is a completely different game to wanting in a self-serving way to break institutions, which is what Trump's project is about. And Trump is in many ways early as a post-truth populist buffoon. We're going to get a lot more of those of the younger generation. I mean, one of the things we need to wake up to is that our politics is no longer the politics of 20 years ago. The political landscape has changed. There are new demands on politicians, and it's positively dangerous to run politicians who are from that period. One of the reasons Biden is facing an uphill task to win, one of the reasons Hillary won the popular vote but lost in 2016, is that politicians who are hyper competent centrists are no longer effective today. You need something more. You need politicians who can positively reckon with the crisis of trust, who can positively reckon with the crisis of polarization, who can positively reckon with the crisis of breakdown of truthfulness. Because it is, of course, itself an outrage and a sign of democratic decline that centrist politicians just continue to tell voters who vote for Trump that they're ignorant, which of course just fuels the problem even more. I mean, that is so spectacularly unwise as a political solution, on top of just being indecent, blaming voters. It's, demophobia, whatever the word is, hatred of crowds, hatred of big groups of citizens. But we have an older generation of politicians who do not have the skills for this world, and we do not have a younger generation of politicians there who have the skill set to negotiate this world responsibly. So we've got quite a few older generation politicians who have the wrong tool set for our world, And we have a lot of younger generation politicians who are doing politics as self-advancement. So this is difficult. And one of the things we all saw, and I don't want to blame any individual for this, is that we do not have the capacity journalistically to deal with post-truth politics. And my answer is that is an urgent and pressing need. Forget Biden's performance. It's not okay to have a political candidate endlessly lying without being challenged. And we do not have the correct journalistic setup to challenge post-truthers. And British journalism had the same problem with Boris Johnson. And Boris Johnson lied in this post-truth sense of not just lying, but dissolving the very idea of coherence between statements. He did that 77 times a week. And journalistic institutions didn't know how to do this, because in the old political world, if somebody lied twice a week, you could just say, well, here they go doing the second lie of the week. But if there are 77 dilutions between falsehood and truth per week or per day, we have no journalistic capacity to respond to this. And we need something more systematic there. At the moment, it's just sort of in the hands of individual journalists, but journalistic institutions have no idea. I mean, it's a mockery of democracy that CNN is putting on this person without any journalistic capacity to challenge them. Fact checking people after doesn't work. We need some way of doing this that's better than what we've got, and it's not brain science. We can come up with better methods. Now, interestingly, if there was a really solid rolling fact check, Biden would be in trouble too, not because he was lying, but because he was glitching so much. He generates some of the fact checks would be in Biden's favor. I mean, he said he generated 15,000 jobs. And then he said that he did something for billions of Americans in connection with some policy. I think jobs too. So Biden would be fact-checked extensively and shown to be wrong in the debate because his brain was glitching, not because he was lying. But we need to be able to do this. At the moment, what we have is a situation where post-truth politicians do post-truth deception 77 times, and journalists say, well, okay, they've spoken. Now let's move on to the next thing. And you can't have that because every time they do that 77 dilutions, our democracy declines by a degree of 0.000000000. 10 more zero is 1%. But this is happening constantly. So these are infinitesimal democratic erosions that are being caused. And we have no response to it at all, practically. And analytically, our response is horrific because analytically, and this is true of the majority of the landscape in the Russia-Ukraine topic, analytically, our main response is to scream disinformation when the problem is that it's our crisis of trust that is proliferating the extent of disinformation we have. So the problem is that even you swat disinformation, you're doing nothing, right, to tackle the engine that's generating it. And even when we're talking about, this is the last main channel video, propaganda, how the Ruskies are interfering in our democracies. They're not interfering to spread disinformation in the first instance. They're doing that too. They're interfering to try to make our crisis of trust worse. They understand this better than we do. They start with trust first, disinformation second. But when we try to beat the Russians out, we start with disinformation and trust second. Their analysis is better of our problem. Our analysis is more delusional. Gabriel, thank you. You're saying thank you for your resolve focus on the importance of resilient clarity in analysis, the need for wise institutional reforms and improvements in your public advocacy for taking long-term strategic perspectives. Thank you so much, Gabriel. I'm just beginning. And I hope to be able to say a lot more, a lot better than what I've done so far. But everything I say, I wanted to sort of fall into this space of truthful hopefulness, that we can not BS ourselves, be truthful, and still be left with a picture of the world that is hopeful. There's a beautiful book by a beautiful man called Jonathan Lear called Radical Hope, about a Native American tribe in the 19th century that was moved to a reservation, lost its culture. And in that context, Jonathan, who's a wonderful psychoanalytic philosopher, tries to tell a story about what it meant for these people to retain a hope of the future, even though their world made so little sense. So radical hope for Jonathan is retaining hope, even if you don't yet see a coherent way of putting together a hopeful and truthful picture of the future. Paolo is asking, why am I so confident? Yeah, I am 100% confident that we will have democratic decline running on. Why is this? Why am I not saying that it's up and down? It could change tomorrow. If you search timestamps to some of my recent lives, or maybe it's not a live, maybe it's a long Q&A. No, it's a long Q&A. So look for long form Q&A or Patreon Q&A in the thumb of a video in the chat channel, and there I answer this. What I try to say is that fundamentally, in most cases, the question you're asking is coming from a residue of teleological or Fukuyamian optimism. That's to say, we've consciously given up on the idea that the world's going to converge in some kind of mode of liberal democratic capitalism. But in the way we go on, we still cling to it. And it's that is making us feel that in 2 or 3 years this could turn around, but it can't. You see, what is happening now is a moment of historical moment where social forces that can't change overnight, can't change over a decade, are declining our democracies. I talk about 4 forces in particular. There are more. And that's a moment of historical moment. And the point about human history is that in it, moments of moment come. So when you're saying, isn't it potentially more realistic to think this could change in 5 years? What I am saying is that the thought, couldn't this just improve in 5 years, is actually not the thought that says, well, different things happen in human history. It's actually the thought that says, why can't this rather strange and contingently sustained aberration of stability that lasted from 1989 till 2001 or 2010 sustain itself? Well, because it needs remarkably special historical factors that aren't there, right? So the idea of thinking, well, we could just snap back into that period in 5 years is not the thought that, yeah, we're open to how history goes. It's actually the thought that history must go by perpetuating the special contingent bubble. Because that's what I want, that's what I want, that's what I need, that's what I want, that's what I want, but it's not. So when I say that it's going to be like this for a couple of decades at least, I'm not saying here's a closed and pessimistic interpretation of the future. I'm actually saying, let's take seriously the thought that the future will be like the past and break out of the illusion that the future has to be like the recent past. John Gray, my lovely public intellectual colleague in the UK, says this. The future will not be like the recent past. The recent past we've had is a contingent bubble. It's gone. We will never go back to it. You can't have these fantasies of return. So the future is going to be like the past. And that's natural. That's not rigidly pessimistic. It's in fact, that's the open position, right? The open position is to say moments of moment come and go, and we have left a particular kind of bubble. The thought that, oh, it could snap back is not an open thought. It's a thought that goes with an incapacity to acknowledge that the bubble is gone. Yeah, I appreciate Liminal is saying Vlad is freaking me out and reassuring at the same time. It's about being in this space that acknowledges that there's room for maneuver, but you can't control everything. Paolo, and sorry if I've freaked you out as well, but reassured you at the same time. We have to realize that we're in a space where we're not out of control, but there are some challenging patterns we can't completely wish away, and that responding to them well is really important, and that they're going to go on for a long time, and that there is no way of just closing our eyes and waiting long enough and then opening our eyes and seeing that all these problems are gone. To some extent, I do think we're dealing with privilege in the sense that, especially the younger generation among us, people under 50, do feel, oh, come on, the Cold War period has to be sustainable. Why is this world now so much less safe, so much less lovely, so much less controllable, so much less intelligible? Why? Surely it's the fault of foreign interference and some bad actors, and if we pop those into their little boxes, we'll be back to where we need to be. So it's about optimism without teleology. It's about hopefulness that's also realistic. And it's about love of human beings as they are with all the challenges they face. And many of the challenges we face, hi Cloudy, good to see you. Many of the challenges we face are challenges that are about institutions that come in between us. And of course, it's very difficult in societies which are so conflicted and polarized, continuing to share institutions well, but we can do a lot better than we're doing. The challenge we face, of course, is that in a perfectly ideal world, what we want is institutions that generate so much collective trust that people who reject the policies these institutions produce always agree on how the institutions produce such policies, the process, right? The dreamy model of a stable democracy is a model where I always accept the process that generated the results I don't like. And we're now entering a realm of a couple of decades at least, where we're going to be fighting not just over the policies, but over the process that generated the policies. I mean, whatever happens in November, there is going to be a democratic crisis of a non-terminal kind in the United States, because if Trump loses, he's not going to accept the result, and if Trump wins, well, people probably accept the result, but they would think that Trump's not a legitimate president because he wants to use the game to break the game. And so whoever wins or loses, the other side will feel they're not quite legitimate. And this is an inevitable path into, deeper levels of democratic crisis. And what the malign foreign actors, the Chinese and the Russians, are doing is they're trying to see where the winds of democratic decline are blowing already, and just trying to add a little bit of extra energy to that. They're trying to pick out what is going badly for us and just gently nudge it with a bit more momentum. Gently, because that's all they can do. It's all the power they've got. Most of the power of our affairs is ours. But they're trying to see what are the most destructive things we're doing to ourselves, and then they're just trying to inflect those just with a little bit more momentum. And of course, what they want to do is inflect with momentum any kind of conflict we have that is about how to conflict, right? Any kind of conflict we have that is so got out of bounds that it's no longer a conflict about a particular issue. It's a conflict about how to conflict about issues. It's a conflict about the game the rules of the game, right? It's conflict where we're not arguing with each other on the pitch about the details of the game. It's where we're arguing about the rules of the game and we don't all agree on what the rules are. And they want to make this more toxic for us. And one way of making this more toxic for us is for us to dramatically distract ourselves from being domestically responsible in how we deal with all of these issues and just begin to focus on the causes of what we're dealing with as, all about malign foreign interference. D saying what decades we have 4 to 6 years left. So that's highly pessimistic in my view. I do think that over the next 30 years, there's a risk of a 20 to 30% knockout rate, realistically speaking, but very cartoonishly speaking, just to give us an indication. There's probably a risk of a 20 to 30% knockout rate for Western democracies, that they become Hungary. And our task is A, to make sure that our own particular country isn't on that collapsed list, and also to make sure that, instead of a 30% knockout rate, it's a 20% knockout rate. Instead of a 20% knockout rate, it's a 10% knockout rate. But the knockouts we're talking about are democratic knockouts. We're talking democratic collapse. We're not talking societal collapse. That is an important distinction too when it comes to pessimism. Let me put this as brutally as I used to talk about it before I was on the internet in sort of public events. I used to say that we're moving, I'm not sure how comfortable I am saying that now, but I'll say it. I used to say that we're moving from a world where things are going comparatively very well to a world where things are going to be going well. And you might say, well, Vlad, what do you mean well? Even in that post-Cold War bubble, we had challenges, not just global challenges, but challenges at home. Massive disadvantage, for instance, in every major Western society. Yeah, but by historical terms, if here you put Thucydides' account of the plagues that came through Athens in his time with a 30% mortality rate, interspersed with wars. In historical terms, most of us, all of us in the West not having any societal collapse, most of us not having a democratic collapse, most of us having democratic decline, all of us having democratic decline. Only a small number of us, only a small number of Western countries collapsing democratically in a way that's still preventable and may even be reversible after it happens. By large historical terms, that's things going well. It's just we're not used to things going well. And we don't want things to go well. We want things to go really, really well. But we also have to retain an historical perspective. Certainly people who have been through the 2 world wars can tell us more about this. But the picture I've described is really scary given how relatively safe our political world has looked, but it is not a catastrophic picture. And when I start heading into catastrophe, which is the term a lot of people worryingly use today, I mean catastrophe for the Democratic Party in the short term, making catastrophic lapse. So I suppose you could describe democratic collapse as democratic catastrophe, but democratic catastrophe is not catastrophe. The people who experience the people who are right now in Hungary who have experienced democratic collapse, they have not been eaten up by monsters. Moreover, the regime hasn't come along and eaten them in the middle of the night and put them into a gulag, right? And while there is this room for historical perspective, there's always this room for differentiation. There's always room to do a couple of percentage points better, a couple of percentage points worse. You know, Hungary is an asphyxiated democracy, but it's not Belarus. Now, I'm not going to go on to say that Belarus is not North Korea, because that is going too far. It's egregious to compare things to North Korea, but historical perspective matters, and a sense of proportion matters. The trouble we have is that we have to go through some period of grief about our expectations, because our expectations are misaligned with our reality. Our expectations are things going really, really well expectations, and if not, then catastrophe. So, and this is why, part of the reason people can't, part of the reason people can't see just how much Joe Biden's performance was a struggling performance is that people are in grief about admitting the reality of the fact that our democracies are struggling. So there's a process of grief we have to go through, because we have rationally given up on certain sort of teleologically optimistic expectations, but they haven't left us. Most people still think teleologically. I bet Obama, who said that Biden's performance was really bad, would still come out and talk about the ebb and flow of history. 4 steps back, 5 steps forward. I don't believe in 5 steps forward, 4 steps back. I think it's contingent, and moments of moment come that take us in different directions. And now we're living through um, a moment of moment that's going to take us somewhere worse than where we were. But no societal collapse and no democratic collapse for most of us. Okay, so we're not really descending into a cataclysmic inferno. We're just not. We're just not. So that feeling, that being optimistic and hopeful about a downward trend with also a lot of open-endedness to it, the feeling that it's perverse to be optimistic and hopeful about that, because what's there to be hopeful about if things are getting worse? Well, part of the problem is that we don't expect a world that is not progressing and improving. And we are still in grief about confronting a world that's not progressing and not improving. And that grief is something that I still think a lot of us need a 5-year conversation about. And one of the ways I'm doing it here on the chat channel, where it's a deliberately algorithmically flatlining channel, is this business of return to the same room and talk 77 times about the same thing. And accommodate us in a pliant and non-defensive way to some of the realities we face. Siliton is asking me about two-party systems in the US. Look, I think reform of political systems and electoral reform too is an important topic that's going to be central for us, because it's a key way of helping our democracies do less badly. The emphasis today in the United States should be on reducing the degree to which the functioning and competition between the two main parties is a calamity. So my feeling is that if the two parties get transcended, it's not likely to be in a constructive way. It's likely to be through a real political mess out of which something else then needs to come. So in terms of where you pull and where you leverage, it should be toward the renormalization as far as possible, not of the old politics, but of the shape of the two major parties. Astro Guy is saying, I'm in my 20s and I feel my generation is foot in the bill for previous generations' relative peace. It's hard not to fall into despair. Look, you have missed out on a particularly magical, with many challenges still, but a particularly magical historical period, 1989 till 2001, or till the early 2010s, or if you want to push it further out, then from 1999 till 2016, if you use Trump's first election as a significant date. Yeah, you're not going to have a period that is as positive and as sort of plentiful in elbow room that is commensurate with exploring how to make the world even better. It's going to be a much more how do we avoid the worst happening world that you live in, with the climate crisis in particular. And climate crisis and every major issue is always tied to democracy. We don't get anything done unless we push it through the democratic system. If our system weakens, every policy weakens. But I would say over the next couple of decades of your life, you're going to have a better time than most previous historical generations. There's just a couple of generations before, a generation before, that had it better than you. Can you deal with that? Can you deal with that? And I think can you deal with it and how you deal with it is always going to be an open question you engage and re-engage with. It's no good saying, I'm okay because I'm okay. I've accepted now that we're dealing with these challenges that we can dance with it when go away. No, you shouldn't say that if you don't accept it. And for all of these challenges, I highly recommend this sort of emotional balance between accepting and refusing to accept. Because hope and sometimes setting somewhat impossible goals is itself an important part of historical experience and getting things done. So, acceptance is important, but also a dance between acceptance and refusal to accept is also important too. James is saying, speaking in historical terms is reassuringly scary. Boris, good to see you and thank you. The French political situation is a mess. Red, blue, crow, a real mess. The British election is a mess too, but because one of the parties is in crisis and the other party doesn't have a clarity of vision. But the French situation is a bigger mess. So we're going to begin gently winding down, I think, toward the 1.5 hour mark. If Biden stays, I'm going to do a video about how he could maximally effectively handle the next few months and what his team would be best advised to do. I don't know if Biden is replaced, whether I'll make a main channel video about this. I might, possibly in this more reassuring tone. This is difficult. Mordred is asking thoughts on Lichtman and his 13 keys and low emphasis on debates and campaigning. Look, in a changing world, old rules don't apply in the same way. This is true of polls as well. Polls are less accurate now than they used to be. So as we are experiencing more polarization and more democratic decline, these older models are not going to work as well. Um, and this is the sort of cruelty of it, that there's a tendency to think that certain generalizations have a certain scientific validity to them. They don't. They're just guesses that hold pretty well for a particular period in history, then they might not. So I'd be open to generalizing from past to future, but I would be deeply serious about understanding how we have a crisis of trust with all of the ramifications of that, that's going to impact how we analyze and predict elections. The kind of political world I've sketched is slightly harder to predict than the political world of 1997. So I would say, if you're looking at models of what's going to happen based on the last 50 years in your country's politics, give them drop less credibility. Gabriel, are there thinkers and artists who have inspired you to pragmatically focus on inspiration and hope for better possible futures? Always curious in your views on how current events may relate to outcomes in China and throughout East Asia. Gabriel, this is maybe taking me a little bit further. The thing that I always do is I always follow not just the literature on democratic degeneration, but also the literature on democratic regeneration. And people who are doing that constructively always inspire me. One of the people who inspires me is the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, who has talked a lot about democratic decline, but is also increasingly talking about democratic regeneration. And there's one word from Jack Taylor that I myself have sort of stolen, and that's the word opacity. Now, he's now in his 90s, but anybody who works in his vein on democratic regeneration, I always recommend to be inspired by. I also am inspired by anybody who takes seriously how we live with difference in a polarized world, and how we take seriously the degree of democratic asphyxiation, the lack of democratic oxygen that people who have given up on democracy and might vote for Trump are feeling. And one of the things I've just mentioned in the last few weeks alone is a lovely book by Jason Blakely on ideology called Lost in Ideology. And it's a bit of a guidebook about how to not lose one's self in one's own ideology in a polarized world. A big inspiration that is a book that I give to a lot of people I love. There are only two books I give to people I love that aren't philosophical books. One's a book on the physicality of music by Anthony Storr, who was a psychiatrist. And the other is this book by Jonathan Lear, which has a couple of philosophical chapters that are a bit hard going, but it's a beautiful small book called Radical Hope, which he wrote about 20 years ago. And I recommend that too. And also, I am myself shockingly not depressed by what is happening, because I look at us through a big prism of where we've come from and where we're going. And that's why there is a part of me that thinks that while a lot of people are really struggling, we are transitioning in the scheme of the contingency and cruelty of history from very good to good. And then our next challenge for the next 20 years is how to not slip from good to good minus minus minus, and from good minus 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 to average, and from average to below. There's always that line. There's always story of democratic tides coming in and out, but within the constraints of historical moments of moment, which last a while. Which is why we can't just snap back into the bubble we've come from. Very often, things that go well in history are a product of lots of very contingent circumstances. You pull a few things out of that equation, and the foundation no longer holds, and you can't return to it. And then the other thing that I'm, of course, very passionate about is just sort of unblinking truthfulness as a precondition for constructive critique of where we are and making things better. Not a good enough answer, but I think your question was really big. But a lot of the challenges we face are global, not just Western, right? So a lot of the patterns that make democracy hard to sustain are global. So countries in many different regions of the world are facing them. Beautiful community. I'm not feeling very ambitious. So if you only give me a score of 2 out of 10 for this chat, in terms of whether I made you feel better or in fact worse, I'll be okay. But I tried to get out there with a bit of a 2 out of 10 effort at least to begin a conversation about freaking out less, but in a realistic way. But I don't believe in a quick fix here. I rather believe in the fact that adjusting like this is itself a process of becoming. And becoming an efficacious citizen in a world where democracy is struggling is itself a process of becoming, because we haven't had to deal with these challenges up until the last decade, perhaps. So this is new to us, and it's going to take many transformations and many griefs to live with it better. But I'm enormously grateful for the possibility to connect and reconnect and connect and reconnect and connect and reconnect. I don't know when, hopefully the next couple of days, a much more bite-sized video might appear on the main channel. That's also why the political meditation on calamitous things happening in politics, and that is on what happened to that hyperactive clown in Russia, Dmitry Medvedev. So how did Putin break Medvedev? I'm going to have probably about a 5 or a 7 minute main channel chat about that, and then take wider political lessons for perhaps something we can learn about how things can slide scarily in politics. Well, lots of gratitude, and thank you so much. And come back with the same questions that I've missed today, because I somewhat abused item 69. Thank you. I've sort of abused our interaction today by raving on too much myself. And I would love to take more questions next time. Gratitude. Thank you so much, and connect with you very soon. Aussie T, bye. Many thanks to all of you. Bye.